Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel, everybody. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today we're talking about 10 players that you can look to drop after Week 15 of fantasy football to make room for those waiver wire ads ahead of Week 16. As always, we'll make sure to cover guys both in deep leagues and shallow leagues, but before we dive on into that list, if you want a chance at winning a signed Jackson Smith and Jigba Seahawks helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros My Playbook app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, or TikTok at Fantasy Pros. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast, so if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to come claim your prize when we announce it. Kicking off our list this week is New England Patriots wide receiver Demario Douglas. From purely a fantasy points perspective, Pop Douglas gave you a fine week scoring 10 fantasy points against the Cardinals in PPR formats. The problem though is that he got bailed out by a touchdown, which was only his second of the season. This now marks back-to-back games where Pop has drawn 4 or less targets and 20 or less receiving yards. In the fantasy playoffs, it's incredibly difficult to rationalize putting Pop into your flex spot unless you are down horrifically bad. In the deepest of leagues, you may have need for Demario Douglas still, but in any standard-sized league, you'd be better off stashing a handcuffed running back than dealing with Pop's incredibly low ceiling. The next player you can look to drop this week is Xavier Legette, wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers. Legette left Sunday's contest against the Cowboys with a groin injury, and as of this recording, his status is unclear moving forward. That being said, though, his injury may be enough reason to move on from him. It's been a rough stretch for Legette, who was inches away from securing a game-winning touchdown against the Eagles in Week 12 for a much better fantasy week. He's finished as a wide receiver 47 or worse, though, in 4 of his last 5 games, despite Bryce Young playing much better football during that stretch. Adam Thielen is now the clear wide receiver 1 in this Panthers offense as well, and it's difficult to trust Legette in any capacity moving forward. If you want to stick with the rookie upside in deep leagues, that's completely justified, but in any other league format, Legette is a fine drop this week going into round 2 of the fantasy playoffs. Our next player you can drop this week is Tennessee Titans wide receiver Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. Just when everybody started to think it was cool to ride with Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, he's now let you down tremendously in back-to-back games. The touchdown regression was inevitable, but the volume has plummeted the last 2 weeks as well. Between weeks 9 through 13, Westbrook-Ikhine was averaging over 5.5 targets per game, but has only seen 2 and 3 targets in his last 2 games. That's resulted in finishes of the wide receiver 65 and the wide receiver 77 respectively, and there is no possible way you can trust spot starting him on the road to a fantasy championship. As far as I'm concerned, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine is droppable in all league formats, so he could become someone else's headache in your league. Another wide receiver you can look to drop this week is Diontae Johnson of the Baltimore Ravens. I'll keep this one short and sweet because I've been harping on managers to ditch Diontae for the last 3 to 4 weeks now. In my eyes, there is no justifiable reason as to why a player who has given you 0 fantasy points in 5 of the last 6 weeks should still be rostered in 36% of leagues. This Ravens offense has too many weapons at its disposal with Derrick Henry, Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews, Lamar Jackson's legs, and heck, let's say Rashad Bateman too, who caught 2 touchdowns on Sunday and has finished as a top 30 wide receiver in 3 of his last 5 games. If Diontae is going to be a headache for John Harbaugh, it's near impossible to see his situation improving in Baltimore. There is 0 reason to continue holding on to him, and he's droppable in every league format. Coming in next on our drop list, we have Tyler Lockett, wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks. It's been clear for multiple weeks, but it's officially JSN time in Seattle now. Since the Seahawks bye in Week 10, Lockett has yet to give you a finish higher than the wide receiver 67. He hasn't drawn more than 3 targets in a game during that stretch, he hasn't caught more than 3 passes in a game either, and he hasn't had a single game with more than 25 receiving yards. 25 receiving yards. It's over for Tyler Lockett, who is clearly the third wheel behind Jackson Smith and Jigba, and a hampered DK Metcalf who still isn't 100% healthy. There's no upside here to be had with Tyler Lockett, and he can be dropped in every league format for a handcuffed running back or anyone else who can give you more than 4.5 fantasy points per game. Our next cut candidate this week is Raheem Mostert, running back for the Miami Dolphins. Mostert has appeared to regain the backup role to Devon Achane in this offense, but the film still doesn't look great. He outplayed rookie Jalen Wright this last week, earning 26 snaps to Wright's 3, but I'm not convinced Mostert holds on to this role for the remainder of the season. Mostert has averaged more than 2.5 yards per carry in only 1 game since Week 10. With the Dolphins falling to 6-8, their playoff odds take a fairly big hit. Jalen Wright wasn't uber efficient when given opportunity as a team's backup running back, but it's not crazy to think that the team may give him more reps down the stretch to give him more game experience. I'm a big believer in stashing handcuffs at this point in the season, so if you want to keep Mostert stashed in the deepest of leagues, feel free, but in any other league format, I'm okay moving on from him. Unless you're playing in a 2-quarterback or superflex league, you can look to part ways with Seattle Seahawks quarterback Geno Smith. Geno exited Sunday Night Football against the Packers with a knee injury, and at this point, his status is quote-unquote up in the air for Week 16. If that isn't enough of a reason to move on from him as your backup quarterback, I'll give you a few others as well. Since Seattle's Week 10 bye, Geno has yet to give you a weekly finish higher than the quarterback 19 and has finished as a quarterback 21 or worse in 3 straight games now. Through the first 9 weeks of the season, Geno led the league in passing yards, averaging nearly 285 yards per game. After their bye week, though, he's averaging only 228 yards per game, which is less than guys like Gardner Minshew, Bryce Young, Cooper Rush, and Will Levis. There is zero reason to be rostering multiple quarterbacks on your team now that we're through all the bye weeks. With or without injury, Geno is droppable in the majority of single quarterback league formats unless you're playing in a wildly deep league. One tight end that you should consider moving on from this week is Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans. Similar to quarterbacks, there are relatively few reasons to stash multiple tight ends on your roster at this point of the season unless you're desperate. Schultz hasn't been outright bad recently, but he's difficult to trust now that Nico Collins is back in the lineup. Since Nico returned to his full workload in Week 12, Schultz has finished as the tight end 28, the tight end 7, and the tight end 33 in his last 3 games. If this offense is at full strength with Nico Collins, Joe Mixon, and even Tank Dell, Schultz is clearly 4th in the pecking order to be utilized. If you question whether you'll have the confidence to start Schultz in any game for the rest of the season, that should be your number 1 sign to dump him for a handcuff running back or high upside wide receiver on the waiver wire. Schultz can be dropped in the majority of non-tight end premium leagues. The next cut candidate we're going to talk about is Denver Broncos running back Javonte Williams. Javonte did lead this running back room in snaps and routes run against the Colts, but the touches were vastly spread out. It was Jaleel McLaughlin who led the Broncos running backs in opportunities with 10, Javonte was given 9, and Audric Estime was given 6. If this remains the trend moving forward for Javonte, it's going to be hard finding a reason to keep him on your roster in shallow leagues. His 6 carries in Week 15 marked the 5th straight game with less than 10 carries, and he now has less than 20 rushing yards in 4 of his last 5 games. At this point, you're praying for a touchdown to bail you out of a miserable week for Javonte. So in shallow league formats, you're better off grabbing a handcuff running back to have insurance for the stud running backs on your team. And lastly, another tight end you can part ways with is Jake Ferguson of the Dallas Cowboys. Ferguson started off the year hot, giving you 4 finishes inside of the top 10 tight ends in his first 7 games. Since Week 10 though, it's been a completely different story. Ferguson has missed 2 games during that stretch, but he hasn't given you a weekly finish higher than the tight end 21. He's averaging only 22.5 receiving yards per game in his last 4 contests as well, and he's become difficult to trust on a week-to-week basis. The Panthers had given up the most fantasy points per game to tight ends this year, so you figured he'd bounce back in Week 15. But his 4.3 fantasy points might have been the final dagger to send him to your waiver wire. You can hold on to Jake Ferguson in deep league formats, but in any shallow league, you can drop him to give your roster more flexibility. Alrighty, y'all, that's it. That's all I've got for you here today, but before we sign off, remember, if you want a chance at winning a signed Jackson Smith and Jigba Seahawks helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros My Playbook app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, or TikTok at Fantasy Pros. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast, so if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to come claim your prize when we announce it.